Hello everyone, hope you're having a wonderful day. Today's episode hits like a punch to the chest. The one small thing that finally gave Tu Tieu a little peace gets destroyed, and when that happens, she doesn't stay quiet anymore. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss what happens next. The market went from loud to frozen in seconds. Yuri stood with his phone held out, the screen angled toward the officials. The crowd leaned in like a single hungry creature, desperate to see who would fall next. Lin's face, still wet with tears, looked too carefully arranged, like she had practiced this expression in front of a mirror until it became a mask. The official's eyes scanned the message thread, then lifted slowly. "This says you told someone to go to the farm while you were here." Lin's lips parted as if she'd been slapped. That's not what it means," she whispered, voice trembling. "Someone is framing me." Yuri didn't raise his voice. He didn't step forward. He only asked one simple question. "Then why is your name on it?" Lin shook her head quickly, tears spilling again. "I didn't send that. My account could have been hacked. Or someone used my phone. Yuri, you hate me? Of course you would do something like this." A few people gasped at that accusation. Tu Tieu felt heat rise in her chest, but she forced her shoulders to stay steady. She could almost hear Mrs. Lan's warning from earlier. Don't give Lin a scene. Lin didn't fight with strength. She fought with stories. The official raised his hand. "Enough. We're not doing a public trial," he turned to Yuri. "Bring the evidence to the office. We'll verify the source." Then he looked at Lin, stern. "You also come. If it's a misunderstanding, you'll explain it there." Lin nodded with trembling obedience, the perfect victim again. "Of course. I have nothing to hide." Tu Tieu stepped forward, voice calm but firm. "Officer, I want to cooperate too." The official glanced at her. Tu Tieu held his gaze. "Inspect my produce, my farm, anything. I have nothing to hide. I only want my livelihood protected." That steadiness changed the air. A few faces in the crowd shifted from suspicion to reluctant respect. Tu Tieu wasn't yelling. She wasn't crying. She was standing like someone who had been forced to grow up too fast. The officials exchanged a look, then one of them nodded. "We'll handle it properly. Everyone, go back to business." But the crowd didn't dissolve cleanly. People drifted away slowly, whispering as they went, carrying the drama like it was part of their groceries. Mrs. Lan stepped beside Tu Tieu, her expression hard and exhausted. "We go home, now." Lin heard that and moved closer, voice fragile. "Mum, Mrs. Lan, please. You know I wouldn't." Mrs. Lan cut her off without even turning fully. "If you wouldn't, then you have nothing to fear from the truth." Lin's breath hitched. She forced a nod, but her eyes flicked to Tu Tieu for half a second, sharp, irritated, before the softness returned. Yuri touched Tu Tieu's wrist lightly. "Let's go." Tu Tieu nodded, but her heart was already racing for a different reason. Because while Lin had been crying in public, someone had been at their home. The ride back to the farm felt longer than it should have. Wind pressed against Tu Tieu's face, but she barely felt it. Her mind kept replaying that message. Someone in the yard touching the flower stand. The gift Yuri made from the dead trunk. The one thing in days that didn't feel like survival. Yuri drove fast, jaw tight, eyes locked on the road. Mrs. Lan followed on another bike, posture stiff, silent in a way that felt dangerous. When the farm gate came into view, Tu Tieu's stomach dropped. The gate wasn't broken. The house looked normal. But something in the yard felt wrong, like the air had been disturbed. Yuri swerved through the entrance and stopped so sharply dust lifted from the ground. He jumped off before the engine even fully died. Tu Tieu stepped in behind him, and then she saw it. The flower stand was lying on its side. The pot was shattered into pieces. Soil was scattered across the yard in dark clumps, as if someone had spilled a piece of their home and left it there on purpose. The flower itself lay crushed. Petals bent, stem broken, the bright colour dulled by dirt. For a second, Tu Tieu forgot how to breathe. It wasn't just a pot. It was the one quiet thing she'd been allowed to keep. Uri crouched immediately, hands shaking as he tried to lift the stand. "It's okay," he said fast, almost panicked. "I can fix it. I can make another—" Tu Tieu's head snapped toward him. "This isn't about fixing wood." Her voice rose, sharp, raw. Uri froze, stunned. Tu Tieu stepped closer to the broken pot, her fist tightening. "I didn't ask for luxury," she said, voice shaking. "I didn't ask for money. I didn't ask for anything big, and even this one small thing can't stay." Mrs. Lan approached slowly, cautious like she was walking toward a storm. Tu Tieu. Tu Tieu's eyes burned, dry with anger. "I'm tired." The words came out like a confession and a warning. "I'm tired of rumours, tired of being watched, tired of working twice as hard just to be called dirty. And now someone comes into my yard and destroys the only peaceful thing I had." Uri swallowed hard. I'm sorry." Tu Tieu turned to him, voice cutting. "You don't need to apologise. The person who did this needs to." A faint sound came from near the fence, footsteps stopping too quickly. All three of them turned at once. A man stood there, hesitating like someone who had been nearby the whole time, hoping to slip away unseen. It was the village friend, the one who had demanded the flower stand yesterday with that lazy laugh, like other people's things were naturally his. He didn't look confident now. He lifted both hands. Hey, don't look at me like that. It wasn't me." Uri rose slowly, eyes cold. "Then why are you here?" The friend swallowed. "I came to check. I heard there was trouble at the market." Tu Tieu let out a short, bitter laugh. "You heard fast." Mrs. Lan stepped forward, voice low and dangerous. "Did you come back to admire what you broke?" The man's face twitched. "I didn't break anything. It was already—" Uri pointed to the ground. "Footprints." The friend went still. Tu Tieu looked down and felt something in her chest harden. Fresh shoe marks were pressed into the dirt, leading from the gate toward the fallen stand and back again. Tu Tieu stepped closer, voice quiet now, too controlled. "What did you do?" The man backed up half a step. "I swear, I didn't mean— Someone told me it was fine. Someone said Uri was giving it away." Uri's eyes narrowed. "Who?" The friend's mouth opened, then closed. Mrs. Lan's voice snapped like a whip. "Say it." The man's hands began to shake. "I don't want trouble. I didn't want trouble." Tu Tieu took another step forward, and for the first time, the calm she had used like armour cracked completely. "I have lived my whole life swallowing trouble," she said, voice trembling with fury. "You don't walk into my home and call it fine." The friend flinched. Uri moved closer, voice deadly calm. "Who sent you?" The man's eyes darted toward the road like he was searching for an escape route. Then he looked at the crushed flower, and something in his face collapsed. In a small, frightened voice, he muttered, "Lin." The name fell into the yard like a stone. Tu Tieu went still. Mrs. Lan's expression changed so suddenly, it looked like grief turning into steel. Uri stared at the man. "Say it again." The friend shook his head fast. "She said you'd be gone. She said you'd be at the market. She said it was just wood and you wouldn't mind. She offered money, just a little. I didn't think it would." "Take it," Tu Tieu repeated slowly, voice thin. "So you came to steal." "Borrow," the man protested, panic rising. "I was going to bring it back." Tu Tieu pointed at the shattered pot. "Borrowing doesn't crush things." The man's voice cracked. "It fell! My friend bumped it. He ran when he heard the bikes." Uri's eyes flashed. "Where is he?" The man pointed vaguely, shaking. I don't know. He ran toward the road." Mrs. Lan stepped forward, her voice ice cold. "You will come with us, now, and you will tell the officials exactly what Lin told you." The man's eyes widened. "No, please, Auntie Lan, Mrs. Lan didn't blink. "Now." Tu Tieu stared at the crushed flower one last time. Then she lifted her head, and something in her expression was different, no longer patient, no longer willing to endure. "Lin wanted to hurt me," Tu Tieu said quietly, "but she chose the wrong way." Yuri looked at her, confused and worried. What do you mean? Tu Tieu's voice stayed low, steady, dangerous. She thinks breaking things will break me. Her eyes flicked to Mrs. Lan, then back to Uri. She doesn't understand. If you keep taking from someone who has nothing, eventually you create someone who has nothing left to lose. Mrs. Lan inhaled sharply, as if the sentence hit her in the heart. Uri's hand hovered near Tu Tieu's shoulder, unsure whether to comfort or brace. Tu Tieu turned toward the house, not like a victim, but like someone preparing for war. And behind her, the broken pot and crushed flour lay in the dirt, screaming one truth louder than any rumour. This was no longer just a fight at the market. This was personal. Tu Tieu didn't go inside to cry. She went inside to breathe, one slow breath, then came back out like she'd made a decision. Her eyes were dry, but the air around her felt colder, sharper. Uri was still in the yard, carefully lifting the flour stand upright. He checked the joints like he was checking a wound, tightening the screws with trembling fingers. Mrs. Lan stood a few steps away, watching the village friend as if he was something dangerous that had crawled into their home. Sit, Mrs. Lan ordered. The man dropped onto the stool, swallowing hard. Auntie Lan, I swear, don't call me that, Mrs. Lan snapped. You don't get to use family words after stepping into my yard like a thief. Tu Tieu knelt by the broken pot and began gathering shards. She moved slowly, not because she was weak, because she was thinking. Every piece she picked up felt like proof, like a silent witness. Uri swallowed. Tu Tieu, I can build another. We can buy another flower. Tu Tieu didn't look up. You can build another stand, she said quietly. But that isn't what she's trying to destroy. Uri froze. Tu Tieu finally lifted her eyes. She wanted me to lose control, she said. She wanted me to scream so the village could say I'm unstable. She wanted me to look like the problem. Her gaze slid to the village friend. And you helped her? The man flinched. I didn't know it would break. You knew it wasn't yours, Tu Tieu cut in. Her voice was calm, but it didn't sound kind. That's enough. Mrs. Lan took one step forward. Tell everything. The village friend's hands shook. She said Uri would be at the market. She said you were acting proud because you got a gift. She said if I took it, it would teach you not to show off. Tu Tieu's mouth tightened. So she paid you to humiliate me. He nodded quickly. Yes, just a little money. Yuri's voice turned cold. How much? 200,000, the man confessed, eyes darting away. Mrs. Lan's eyes narrowed. And the other man? The one you mentioned earlier? The village friend hesitated, then blurted, He's not from here. Lin brought him in. She said he'd help me carry it fast. She told him to wear a black jacket. Yuri's jaw clenched so hard the muscle jumped. Tu Tieu's eyes sharpened. A black jacket, she repeated, tasting the words like poison. The same black jacket villain she used at the market. The man nodded, panicked. She said people need someone to hate. She said if the story has a villain, the crowd will stop asking questions. The yard went silent. Even the birds sounded far away. Tu Tieu stood up slowly. Uri, she said, holding out her hand, your phone. Uri blinked. Why? Because if she messaged once, she left traces, Tu Tieu replied. Messages, calls, timestamps. And if she paid him, there's always a trail. Liars get lazy when they think they're winning. Uri handed his phone to her without hesitation. Tu Tieu turned to the village friend. Your phone too? He stiffened. No. Why do you need... Mrs. Lan stepped closer, her voice quiet and terrifying. Give it. His fingers fumbled as he pulled it from his pocket and placed it into Tu Tieu's palm like it was burning him. Tu Tieu didn't do anything dramatic. No hacking, no tricks. She opened the most obvious places, recent messages, call logs, and the exact times. Then she stopped. Because there it was. A short thread, minimal words, careful, controlled, exactly Lin's style. Go now, take it, he'll be at the market. Tu Tieu held the screen toward Mrs. Lan. Mrs. Lan read it once, then again. Her face didn't collapse into tears. It hardened into something sharper than anger, something like betrayal finally turning into clarity. "Get up," Mrs. Land said to the village friend. The man stood so fast he nearly fell. "Are you taking me to the office?" "Yes," Mrs. Land answered, "and you will speak. If you lie, you'll regret it." He nodded frantically. I'll tell everything." Tu Tieu walked to the porch and gently placed the crushed flower there, like a warning flag. Then she looked at Yuri. "We go now." Yuri glanced at the broken stand, then at her face. "Are you okay?" Tu Tieu's voice was steady. "Not yet, but I'm done swallowing this." Mrs. Land pushed the village friend toward the gate and they left the yard behind, leaving the shattered pot in the dirt like a message Lin had written too boldly. The local office smelled like old paper and spinning fan air. Faded posters about community harmony hung crooked on the wall, as if even the building didn't fully believe its own advice. Lin was already there. She sat upright, hands folded neatly, eyes red like she'd been crying for hours. The moment she saw Mrs. Lan, her face lit up with relief. Too quickly, too perfectly. "Mum, Mrs. Lan," Lin whispered. "Thank God you're here. Please tell them I didn't do anything. Yuri is trying to destroy me." Mrs. Lan didn't respond. Tu Tieu stepped in behind her. Lin's eyes flicked to Tu Tieu's face, sharp for half a heartbeat, then softened again into that careful victim look. Yuri entered last, jaw tight. The village friend hovered behind them, pale and sweating. The official looked up, annoyed. "You're back again?" Mrs. Lan placed the phone on the desk. "Read this." The official leaned forward, scanning. His expression tightened. "This message says..." Lin interrupted instantly, voice trembling. "That's fake! Anyone can type words into a phone. Anyone can claim it's from me." Tu Tieu spoke calmly. "Then verify it," she said. "Verify the number, verify the account, verify the timestamp. This isn't gossip." Lin turned toward Tu Tieu, tears shining. "Why are you doing this?" she pleaded. "I apologized. I tried to fix the market. And now you're attacking me because a flower pot broke?" Yuri's voice cut in, sharp. "You sent someone into our yard," Lin gasped dramatically. "I did not." Mrs. Lan finally spoke, and her voice made the room feel smaller. "Stop acting." Lin froze. "Mrs. Lan." Mrs. Lan stared at her like she was seeing a stranger wearing Lin's face. "If you want forgiveness, tell the truth." Lin shook her head fast, tears appearing on command. "I am telling the truth. They hate me. Yuri hates me. Tu Tieu hates me. Why would anyone believe me?" The official turned to the village friend. "Did she contact you?" The man swallowed hard. His eyes darted toward Lin. Lin's gaze met his. Quiet. Sharp. Warning. "Mrs." Lan snapped. "Don't threaten him with your eyes." Lin flinched like she'd been struck, then forced innocence back on. "I'm not..." The official tapped the desk. "Answer." The village friend's voice shook. She told me to go. She said Yuri would be at the market. She offered money." Lin's face tightened for a split second, so quick most people would miss it. But Tu Tieu didn't miss anything. Then Lin burst into sobs. "He's lying. He's blaming me to save himself. Mrs. Lan, please, tell them you know me." Mrs. Lan's eyes stayed dry. "I knew you," she said quietly. "That's why I believed you for years." Lin's sobs stuttered. Tu Tieu stepped forward. Her voice was calm, but it carried weight. "Lin, you keep calling yourself the victim," she said, "but you're the one who sends strangers into a home." Lin's eyes narrowed behind the tears. "Don't act like you're innocent," she snapped, and the sweetness slipped. "You came into my life and took my mother." Mrs. Lan inhaled sharply. Tu Tieu didn't flinch. "No," she said. "You tried to keep her by turning love into a weapon." The official looked down at the phone again. "We will verify the source of these messages and the payment claim. If confirmed, this is harassment and attempted theft. Lin, you're instructed to stop approaching their property until the investigation is complete." Lin's face drained. Attempted theft? That's insane! Yuri's voice was cold. Tell that to the broken pot. Mrs. Lan stepped closer to Lin, voice low enough to feel like a knife. After this, she said, you and I will talk. Alone. Lin's lips trembled. Mrs. Lan, please. I'm still your daughter. Mrs. Lan didn't blink. A daughter doesn't break her mother's home to win a fight. Lin's tears stopped. Her mask didn't slip this time. It cracked. Her eyes locked onto Tu Tieu, all sweetness gone, replaced by something sharp and promised. As Tu Tieu turned to leave, Lin's voice followed, low and shaking, not with sadness, but with rage. This isn't over. Tu Tieu paused at the door and looked back once, steady and unafraid. I know, she said, and as they stepped outside, the air felt colder than it should have, because Tu Tieu understood the real cliffhanger now. If Lin could destroy a flower stand just to make a point, next time she might aim for something that could never be repaired.